Hola, me llamo Ellie. ¿Cómo están? La, la revolución industrial tiene impacto la trabajo durante a 1800 a 1900. 30 porque los niños trabajaron en la fábrica. Mi periodo tiene trabajo y es sucio y desorganizado. El trabajo está creciendo. In the Second Industrial Revolution, child labor was a very common idea and was everywhere in the United States. Children oftentimes worked because their families couldn't provide the basic needs. Things such as shelter, clothing, food, and clean water were not available and couldn't be provided by these families, so the parents would go out and work, and when they still weren't able to provide enough, their children were forced into labor. During the Second Industrial Revolution, there was a rise in factories and mines and need of workers, and children would work for lower wages, and they could also fit into smaller spaces and were less likely to strike, and so they were commonly hired. The conditions for these people were not good. These children were working in unsafe conditions. It was very disorganized, and things were everywhere. There's things that were all over the floor, and a variety of ages worked. Children as young as 3 years old would work in these factories, and it was very dangerous. Machinery was left without protection, and so children were injured on machinery, and they lost fingers and arms and legs, and sometimes they even lost their lives. There's poor ventilation, and so it made it really hot or really cold, and it was very dirty. And these boys are they have dirt all over their faces, and everything's everywhere. They easily caught diseases because of the poor ventilation, and it was common for children to be working 12-hour shifts or more without any breaks. These are paper boys, and they worked all times of the year. They would work during the winters and during the nights, and so it was very cold, and they didn't have the right clothing, and so they were very cold, and they worked from 12 to 14-hour shifts without breaks. So not only were they physically exhausted, but they're also mentally exhausted, and later on that played a role in some of the effects from that. Edgar Gardner Murphy was a man. He was originally a priest until he later went on to fight for better conditions for these children and for child labor. He gave a speech, and in his speech he says, "I have seen children 6 and 7 years old with their little fingers mangled in machinery and their bodies numb from exhaustion." These children were always exhausted, and they weren't sleeping very much, and so they went out and they would riot and tell people that they wanted to get an education, they wanted to go to school and learn. And he later says in another speech that most of these children didn't even know how to write their own names, and so they would go out into the streets to riot, tell the world what they wanted, and without Edgar Gardner Murphy, laws might not have been put in place sooner. And in 1938, laws were put in place against child labor, and they were able to go to school rather than work.